Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Timothy here with Jank Diver Gaming, and today we're outlining our Kaldheim update for the Peasant Cube. Kaldheim has a lot of different themes and mechanics floating around, so the set comes with its fair share of hits and misses as far as cube inclusions are concerned. On one hand, we've got snow and tribal synergies, which don't gel with the focus of the peasant environment, and on the other hand, we've got new mechanics like Boast and Foretell, which give us more tools to play around with. On top of that, Kaldheim is full of awesome sagas and dual lands, so we're going to see a bit of restructuring in our multicolored sections as well. With all that being said, we're looking forward to these new changes, and we hope to see you at the start of the new Cube season. If you're new to Jank Diver Gaming, you can join our Discord with the link in the description below, and you can subscribe to this channel for more updates like this, including our unrestricted Cube updates coming up in a few days. We'll kick off the white section with the most slam dunk inclusion from Kaldheim, which is Usher of the Fallen, taking the place of Splendor Mare. Usher is a 2-1 for a single white mana, which has traditionally been a good stat line for this cube, and features the new Boast mechanic, which for 1 and a white creates a 1-1 token. Boast abilities can only be activated once per turn and only if that creature is attacking, so think of it like the raid mechanic but in the form of an activated ability. The Boast creatures are interesting because they don't come with inherent ways to protect themselves, so oftentimes you'll attack with a card like Usher of the Fallen, use its Boast ability, and trade it off in combat. Of course, if you land this on turn 1 on the play, your opponent might not have a blocker for the first few turns, so you can go nuts making 1-1s early in the game. We don't have a ton of combat tricks in this cube, but protection spells and pump spells should play nicely alongside Boast creatures. We cut Splendormare, which is a totally reasonable creature, but never excellent outside of aggro matchups. We wanted to trim White's curve a little bit, since we still find ourselves with a glut of 3 drops, and bringing in a premium 1 drop seemed like a good exchange. The other Boast creature you'll be seeing in white is Battershield Warrior, which is taking the place of Emissary of Sunrise. The Warrior is a 2-2 for 3, which isn't a spectacular stat line, but for 1 and a white, you can boast it and give all of your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. This means you'll often be attacking with your Battershield Warrior as a 3-3 while also pumping the rest of your team alongside it. Obviously, there's a pretty bad fail case for this creature since Boast does literally nothing on defense. If you find yourself in a position where you can't attack with the warrior, it's a pretty miserable card. Still, it sparked our interest enough that we decided to cut the Emissary of Sunrise, which again isn't a bad card, but doesn't get drafted often and doesn't have much of a home in the cube. It's generically good, but not hotly desired by any deck in particular, so we removed it to try out Battershield Warrior, which may end up being great, or could end up being a complete dud. Guess we'll find out soon. Clarion Spirit is next on our list, which will be subbed in over Steward of Solidarity. Clarion Spirit is a 2-2 for 2, which creates a 1-1 flying spirit whenever you cast your second spell each turn. White has a low enough curve in general that we believe you should be able to double spell a decent amount of the time, at least every other turn if your deck is built to optimize the spirit. Steward of Solidarity is similar in that you get a guaranteed 1-1 every other turn, but that starts on the turn after you play Steward, so it's a pretty slow accumulation of creature tokens. Clarion Spirit also makes flying tokens, which is a big plus over the Steward. Adventures like Fairy Guidemother and Shepherd of the Flock make it pretty easy to double spell, and Clarion plays very well alongside Oketra's Monument, which makes it easier to pump out multiple spells in one turn. I could see a scenario where Clarion Spirit underperforms, but I've got my eye on it now as an exciting addition to the cube. Our next addition is our first Foretell card, Shepherd of the Cosmos, which will be taking Wispweaver Angel's spot. Let's go ahead and spell out how Foretell works first. For 2 mana, on your turn, you can exile a Foretell card from your hand face down. On a later turn, you can cast that card for its Foretell cost, which is generally a good 1 to 2 mana cheaper than the CMC of that card. In other words, you can give up a small mana investment earlier in the game to cast a spell for cheaper on a later turn. Shepherd of the Cosmos, for example, costs 6 to cast, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to reanimate a creature with CMC 2 or less. However, if you spent the 2 mana to foretell it on an earlier turn, you can cast it for its foretell cost of 4 instead. You end up paying the same total amount of mana, but you can effectively get your 6 drop out on turn 4 this way. It's basically a tempo loss in exchange for a more explosive turn on down the line. The Shepherd itself is decent, giving you a 3/3 flyer and a small creature from your graveyard all in one, and Wispweaver felt like a cool card that was just clunky enough that we could cut it to make room for something new. Interestingly, Shepherd of the Cosmos is the only white card with Foretell that we're including, so it's a bit of a dead giveaway when a white player foretells a card, but white didn't have much else in the way of powerful Foretell cards at common and uncommon. Foretell cards play well alongside one another since it keeps the opponent guessing and gives you more ways to use your mana, but we're stuck with just the one in white for now. Our final addition to white is Stalwart Valkyrie, which will take the place of the Birth of Meletus. It's a bit of a jump in terms of her curve, but Stalwart Valkyrie has a mana reduction ability that might make up for that. First off, Birth of Meletus is an interesting card. I'd shy away from calling it an all-star or anything like that, but the combined set of abilities you get from it come together to make it a nice value package. However, it's hard to tell what white deck really wants it, and outside of some life gain synergies, it doesn't fit in very many decks. We decided to cut it for another creature, one we'd expect to be quite decent. The Valkyrie has a baseline of a Snappin' Drake, a 3/2 flyer for 4, which isn't embarrassing by any stretch, but it costs only 2 to cast if you can manage to exile a creature from your graveyard when you cast it. It won't come down on turn 2 often, but it will be a cheap, efficient threat later in the game quite often. It adds another potent flyer to the white section, which is lacking good flyers, so we're happy to include it. Kicking off blue, we've got a pretty simple change that we'll see in the unrestricted cube as well. Behold the Multiverse will take the spot of Glimmer of Genius, and it's pretty easy to see why. Glimmer is a great draw spell, but the energy is useless 99% of the time. When you take the energy out of the equation, Behold the Multiverse is just a strictly better version. It'll still scry 2, draw 2 for 4 mana at instant speed, but the Foretell mechanic gives it a layer of flexibility over Glimmer. I'm actually surprised to see this card at common. It's a powerful draw spell without Foretell, and the option to pay in installments is great. It's also interesting that the total amount of mana you spend to foretell this and then cast it on a later turn is still 4, so you're not overpaying for the effect. It'll largely play the same as Glimmer in the late game, but even then I can imagine turns where you spend 2 mana to exile it, pass the turn with some sort of counter magic or interaction up, then cast this from exile anyway if you don't need to interact. The end result is the same as casting a Glimmer, but you give yourself an opening to play around the opponent's cards a bit better. I'm sure everybody saw the next card coming, and that's because, well, it's saw it coming. Edging out Teferi's Time Twist, we're looking to up the number of Foretell cards and saw it coming while being a perfectly reasonable cancel variant on its own, plays exceptionally well alongside other Foretell cards. It's the perfect Foretell card to exile early and have available later in the game at a discount. We're not sure how it stacks up in comparison to Neutralize and Sinister Sabotage, but it's unique enough that we wanted to include it without cutting one of those. Teferi's Time Twist is a mainstay from the initial version of the cube, and while we've always classified it as a unique effect for blue decks, it's not something that's ever been necessary, and it's debatable that it's ever even been good. It's a card that was going to get cut eventually, and now is that time. Keeping the train rolling, we're bringing in Depart the Realm over into the Royal. Again, Foretell cards play well together since they help disguise each other to some extent, and we already included the draw spell and counter spell variants with Foretell, so we feel that the bounce spell should make the cut too. Into the Royal isn't a bad card, quite the opposite actually. It's just that we already have Blink of an Eye, and it's felt a little disingenuous to have 2 functional copies of the same card in a singleton cube. We make exceptions sometimes, as with Terramorphic and Evolving Wilds, but cut in Royal for Depart the Realm should lead to a tiny bit more variety than just having 2 copies of Blink of an Eye. Our final Foretell card in blue is Raven Form, which will be coming in over Bubble Snare. Bubble Snare was a recent addition, but we're noticing a theme with these blue enchantments that lock down creatures. They tend to play out pretty poorly in the Peasant environment, with previous versions like Narcolepsy and Frogify being on the lower end of playables. Bubble Snare seemed like an upgrade, but has fell in much the same spot. It is important, however, to give blue some form of interaction for problematic permanents that have made it underneath counter magic. Blue has plenty of bounce spells, but that tends to be a temporary solution. We had 2 new cards worth talking about from Kaldheim as potential inclusions. The one we opted not to play is Bind the Monster, which locks a creature down at an efficient cost, but costs some life to do it. This seems good to us, but given our experience with these sorts of effects, we chose not to sub it in. Instead, we went with Raven Form, which exiles a creature or artifact at the cost of giving the permanent's controller a 1/1 flyer. That's a real downside, but not an insurmountable one, and the upside of having an unconditional answer to almost anything, including vehicles, which tend to play favorably against blue decks, felt good. Foretell is icing on the cake since it fits alongside our other blue inclusions quite nicely. We'll be rounding out blue with a card that's not new to Kaldheim, but something we feel has potential in the Peasant environment. That is Fairy Duelist, taking the spot of Kitesail Corsair. Corsair is largely a card you begrudgingly put in your deck because you didn't find a better flyer, but it's the worst of the bunch when it comes to 2-drop flyers, and it plays defense poorly. Fairy Duelist fits more along the lines of what blue decks want to be doing. That is, holding up answers and playing at instant speed, and while the -2, -0 ability seems weak on paper, if you've played with this card in Ravnica Limited, you know it gets to ambush unsuspecting players every now and then. Not a high quality include by any stretch, but a small improvement over an otherwise lackluster card. Black's a little light for this update, with Poising the Cup being one of only 2 additions from Kaldheim. It's a pretty easy swap too, since it's functionally a better version of Murder, 1 black to destroy a creature, with Foretell for 1 and a black. It also gives you a bonus for casting it as a Foretold card, tacking on a Scry 2 for your troubles. We're always cautious with new black removal spells since we need to monitor how effective the unconditional removal matches up against the other colors in the cube, but the additional text this has over Murder didn't seem over the top by any means, so we felt good about the strict upgrade in card quality here. Thankfully, the other black card we were interested in also has Foretell. That's Vengeful Reaper, which will be bumping Carrion Grub out of the Peasant Cube. Vengeful Reaper is a keyword creature with Foretell, Flying, Death Touch, and Haste for 4 mana, or 1 and a black if you foretold it on a previous turn. At 4 mana, this would be a respectable card, but Foretell pushes it into different territory, since you can just jam this on turn 3 and attack right away. Of course, we should point out that Foretell might not be at its best in aggro decks, since they suffer the most from giving up turn 2 without affecting the board, but the Reaper seems good enough that it's worth a trial run. Carrion Grub is a card we've had our eye on for a while now, with the intention of booting it from the cube, so now's its time to go. We had high hopes when we included it, but sadly the self-mill strategy hasn't been a potent one, and too often Carrion Grub is just a 1/5 or 2/5 for 4 with little purpose on board. We could see coming back to this one if our graveyard decks become more potent in the future. Red's going to be a little bit dicey too, with our first of only 3 swaps being Fearless Liberator over Blood Rage Brawler. Brawler fits a design you see often, which is overstated cheap creature with a drawback, and it's becoming apparent that those creatures don't have much mileage in this cube. We wanted to plant this as an early 4-power creature for the Gruul decks, but it seems Gruul decks would rather forego the early aggression in favor of having a stronger mid-game and late game. You almost always want a mana dork on turn 2, and when you discard a card to the Brawler and it gets bounced or answered immediately, it's a bit of a disaster. We're not entirely hyped for Fearless Liberator, but similar to the white Brawl creatures, it has some real potential when it goes unchecked, and if it trades off and leaves behind another 2/1 in its wake, that's probably reasonable as well. We're going to try it out, but we've got to see it in action before we're hooked. Dual Strike is our second inclusion, and it's taking Scorching Dragonfire's spot. Dragonfire is a fine removal spell, but a quick look at red tells you that we've got removal covered in spades, and Dragonfire not going to the dome is a pretty real downside compared to the other burn spells. Dual Strike fits our unique effect category, as on its own it doesn't actually do anything. However, we see potential in being able to exile it with Foretell, and then fork a good draw spell or removal spell later in the game. We see it as a card tailored to blue-red spells decks, but this can also combo well with black's cheap removal or reanimation effects, or even white's token-producing spells or +1/+1 counter cards to double up on an effect. We've had access to this type of effect in the past, but this version seems interesting enough and has some substantial upside, so let's see what it's capable of. Crush the Weak is our final red card, a Pyroclasm type sweeper that we'll be playing over Cinderclasm, a similar card that I'm actually quite fond of. Cinderclasm and Flame Sweep are both powerful cards, and we've come to value our red sweepers very highly. It's not that Cinderclasm's bad, it may even be better on average than Crush the Weak, but Crush has two things going for it despite being a sorcery. First, it has Foretell, which isn't huge on a sorcery, but does give it some flexibility. Second, and more importantly, Crush exiles the creatures that it kills, a la Cry of the Carnarium, which is kind of a big deal. Sometimes players have multiple Blood Artist type effects on board, and Crush can bypass the death triggers, whereas a sweeper like Cinderclasm means you're taking a bunch of damage. For the record, we find that Flame Sweep's ability to dodge your flyers does give it a small edge over the other options, so we decided Cinderclasm would be the cut. Green kicks off with what we think is a pretty obvious change. We're bringing in Snakeskin Veil over Blossoming Defense, which actually just made it into the cube with one of our last big updates. I kind of made a big deal last time over how much of an upgrade Blossoming Defense was over Ranger's Guile, but the comparison to Snakeskin Veil is an interesting one. Obviously, we have a green-white +1/+1 counter deck, so the counter is a bit more desirable than a temporary +2/+2, but I'm leaning towards saying that Snakeskin Veil is just a better card even if you don't care about counters. As far as combat tricks are concerned, +2/+2 is better than +1/+1, duh, but a +1/+1 counter is usually better than +2/+2 for a turn. When you get to win a combat or blow out a removal spell, and your creature comes out the other end with a permanent buff, that's big game. We're always on the hunt for synergy cards, and Snakeskin Veil is a more synergistic version of a card we're already playing, so it's an easy include. The only other new green card that we're including is Rune of Might, and it'll be more of a placeholder to sub out Explore. We brought in Explore alongside the landfall creatures from Zendikar Rising. Turns out those cards were pretty atrocious, so we took all of them back out, but Explore managed to stay in as a non-offender that you could free roll in most green decks. Green does want most of its ramp to be in the form of creatures though, so Explore was never an untouchable card, and we are indeed touching it to try out Rune of Might. We can mostly ignore the equipment text on this, but keep in mind that it can be attached to any permanent, including vehicles and the like, to grant them trample whenever they become a creature. More importantly, it functions as a cantrip and aura that grants trample to a big stompy creature that doesn't already have it. Trample is a pivotal ability for green decks to function, so Rune of Might is filling a small role there, and the +1/+1 in card draw help it a bit. It probably won't be around for long, but Peasant offerings for green in this set were pretty slim, so here we are. Speaking of offenders and non-offenders, Vinemare is happily being given the boot for snapping Sailback. Sailback is a fine creature, it kind of always has been, and it's been in and out of the cube numerous times at this point. It's just solid, and usually makes its way in when we're trying to get rid of a creature but don't have an obvious one-for-one swap that we like. The big change here is that Vinemare is out, and honestly, good riddance. It goes against our design philosophies a little bit as we try to make games fun and interactive, and large hexproof creatures lead to uninteractive, unfun gameplay, especially when they have random evasive abilities tacked on. That is why we originally included Vinemare. It was included to intentionally dunk on black at a point where black decks were significantly better than the other colors, but things have evened out a bit, black has fallen slightly, and green has been bolstered with recent updates, so Vinemare has served its purpose and it's time for it to go. Finally, for green, we're going to test out Fungal Rebirth over Pulse of Marasa. Pulse is a pet card of mine, and it's certainly powerful at what it does, but we're curious to try out Fungal Rebirth. We'll talk about this more later, but the big inspiration behind doing this is the inclusion of some of the sagas we'll see in the gold section, and Fungal Rebirth can pick up any permanent from the graveyard, whereas Pulse is limited to creatures and lands. The 6 life is a big swing on Pulse, but hopefully we can maneuver Fungal Rebirth to a place where it makes the Saproling tokens more often than not. We're not 100% sure this swap is correct, so this is another one to keep our eyes on moving forward. Kicking off our gold and colorless section, we'll note that Azorius and Boros will not be receiving any updates, but each other color pair will have at least one change. Demir's is Port of Carfell, replacing Discovery Dispersal. Blue-black is our best performing color pair in the Peasant Cube, so it's hard to change things up, but we think the blue-black land in this cycle is a perfect fit for the color combination. I've stated in our archetype breakdown that Dimir supplies us with our primary control deck of the cube and has a Reanimator sub-theme tied in. This land plays perfectly into both of those themes. It's expensive, but turning a land in the late game into your best creature in the graveyard is powerful. If this was a 6 or 7 mana sorcery, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I can't overstate how powerful it is to have this effect tied to a land. Yes, coming in tapped matters, but Dimir can get away with playing some tap lands. Not all the lands will be making it in from this cycle, but this one seemed like a slam dunk to us. Izzet will receive a single change with Igar the Freezing Flame replacing Goblin Electromancer. The poor goblin did nothing wrong, it's just that we want to try something new and Igar caught our attention. It's a weird ability, but Igar lets you draw a card whenever a wizard, giant, or spell you control deals excess damage to an opponent's permanent. This means using a 3 damage burn spell on a 2 toughness creature nets you a card, or, as we understand it, engaging in combat where your attackers deal more damage to your opponent's blockers than they have toughness also nets you cards. Think of it like trample damage, but instead of dealing excess damage to the opponent, you draw a card. It works on defense too, and it probably has some interesting interactions that we're not even thinking of. It's bizarre and intriguing, so it's coming in, and it could even promote a tempo burn deck that clears blockers out of the way while also piling up extra cards. Maybe we're reading the card wrong, but it's got our attention for now, and we'll see what fun things it can do. Orzhov hurt us a little bit because Basilica Bellhaunt is a fantastic card, but we want to test Great Hall of Starnheim. Our reasoning is that no matter what black-white deck you end up in, you're probably going to play the Great Hall since it's a pretty free include, and you'll get some significant value out of it. You have to find a body that you're willing to sacrifice, and your Angel token is vulnerable to bounce spells, but as I mentioned before, you're getting this effect for a very minimal cost. That is, you have to be willing to play a tap land in your deck. As sad as I am to see Bellhaunt come out, I like the idea of including more utility lands with powerful effects, since it means players will get to play more of the cards they've drafted, and I've gone on record for saying how useful it is to spend a draft pick on a land that's 100% to make your deck. Simic still has a lot of catching up to do in the Peasant Cube, but at least it was able to pick up some high quality gold cards from Kaldheim. Littjara Mirror Lake seems like another potent tap land from the cycle, as it's a land that turns into a copy of your best creature on board later in the game. It functions similarly to the blue-black one, but has a bit of a fail case where you have no creatures on board. Still, I wouldn't scoff at the ability to turn one of my lands into a threat in the late game, and this even fronts you an extra +1/+1 counter on top of that. Skyrider Patrol was the cut for this. It was included in an attempt to give green creatures a persistent form of evasion, but it seems to always miss the mark. You don't often get to activate it the turn it comes down, and investing your mana into the ability only to have your opponent interact with the target can be miserable. It's an easy cut and an easy include to take its place. Okay, look, I don't know how to pronounce this one, but Simic also got Morite of the Frost, which will replace River Hoopy. Look, I know people love the Hoopy, and maybe it hasn't had enough time to shine, but blue-green plays best as a beatdown deck paired with tempo plays, and Hoopy doesn't quite fit the bill. Morite is a clone of your best creature, comes in with 2 additional +1/+1 counters, and even has Changeling, which matters very little, but I feel I should mention it anyway since I made a big deal about Changeling in my previous video. Don't get caught up on the Snow Claws, as it largely doesn't matter for the purposes of Cube. It's a generally powerful card that we think will be more fitting to Simic's playstyle than the Hoopy, which again is a good card, but not good enough to make up for Simic's poor performance. Rakdos got some spicy additions, the first of which is the uncommon saga Kardar's Vicious Return. Carnival Carnage has been a good to great top-end card for Rakdos decks, and the split card aspect of it definitely helps its playability, but we're suckers for a good value saga, and KVR's got us covered. It's a mini Eldest Reborn, but note that the second chapter forces both players to discard a card, not just the opponent, so find a way to mitigate that if you're playing this saga. Of course, the third chapter lets you recuperate some of the losses that come with playing this card, and the overall effect, with all three chapters combined, is to discard a card and sacrifice a creature to deal 3 damage to any target, make your opponent discard a card, and reanimate a hasty threat with an extra +1/+1 counter. It's pretty complex all in all, and these are the type of cards that thrive in the Peasant environment. Tricky to use, but a high payoff when used well. Rakdos Firewheeler hasn't been here long, but we're cutting it to make room for Kardar Doomscourge. Seems appropriate given the inclusion of Kardar's Saga. It has a bit of a wonky effect that feels out of place in the set, essentially goading all of your opponent's creatures into attacking you the turn after it enters the battlefield. On top of that, it drains your opponent for a life every time an attacking creature dies, and it doesn't matter when that happens or whose creature it was. If an attacker dies, you're draining 1. This is all on top of a 4/3 body for 4, which isn't sacrificing anything. Rakdos Firewheeler is exceptional, but we knew we were bringing in 2 more 4-drops for the Rakdos section, so we did the responsible thing and cut ties with the other 4-drops in the section to make room for some new toys. I personally have Svella Ice Shaper pegged as one of the most ridiculous uncommons we're going to have access to. It follows the same design philosophy we've seen on a lot of these uncommon gold legends, in that it's huge upside that sacrifices nothing on the bottom end. You're getting a clunky but useful mana ramp ability, plus a mana sink that lets you free roll spells from the top of your library with no restrictions on what you can cast, and all of this is stapled to a 3 mana 2/4, which blocks effectively enough to give you time to do all of this. Unless I'm missing something or misreading something, this card seems nuts to me and I'm eager to test it out. Voltaic Brawler was the cut since it advertises a green-red aggro deck, and while that's an archetype that's certainly viable, green-red focuses more on mid to late game and usually forgoes its early attackers in favor of big late game threats. Brawler's a good creature, just one that conflicts a little with how the color pair typically plays out. Domri's going to take a backseat for Arnie in the Gruul section, as Arnie Slays the Troll will slot in over a largely redundant fight effect. Sure, Arnie Slays is a fight spell as well, and a weaker one at that when you compare it to Domri's Ambush, but the combined set of abilities on the saga trump the one-shot advantage you get from the Ambush. You get an additional +1/+1 counter when all is said and done, and the extra red mana on Chapter 2 is a nice little throw-in. Chapter 3 even nets you some extra life, although that's an extra bonus rather than an incentive to play the card. There are board states where Domri's Ambush is more desirable, for example against Death Touchers, but Arnie Slays is a more potent combination of effects for the same overall mana investment. It asks you to have creatures on board and for you to keep them around, but a green-red deck, that's not a hard sell. Selesnya was the hardest section for us to parse out, and we ended up making more swaps for this one gold section than we did the entire mono-black section of the cube. First up is Fall of the Imposter over Wally's Raptor. The Raptor is a fine little creature and fits the counters theme nicely, but it's not a unique effect, and there are plenty of other proliferate cards in the green section of the cube. Fall of the Imposter seems potentially busted, netting you 2 counters over the course of the first 2 turns, and then straight up exiling your opponent's biggest creature on Chapter 3. Your opponent will see the removal coming a mile away and be able to play around it, but that won't stop you from getting your money's worth from the saga. An effect which doubles as a counter producer and a removal spell all in one felt great to us, so we're stoked to bring it in. Maja Bretagard Protector will replace Conclave Cavalier, another casualty of the CCDD cycle with this update. Conclave Cavalier is an exceptional creature, and while it doesn't play into Selesnya's themes in a meaningful way, it holds its own quite well. The thing is, as the Peasant Cube becomes more and more focused on synergy decks and tight interactions within color pairs, the less we have room for one-off powerful cards. So we did the responsible thing and trimmed the Cavalier for another one of Kaldheim's busted uncommons. Maja creates 1/1s with what is essentially landfall and provides an actual anthem effect that's not actually in the form of +1/+1 counters. It has an immediate impact on the board when you play it, and it provides a small value engine that makes use of extra land drops. We have some precedent for powerful 5 drops with low stats not making the cut, so I could see a world where Maja underperforms, but until we see that, this card seemed too powerful not to test out. Selesnya will also pick up its uncommon tap land, which will take the place of Pledge of Unity. Pledge is powerful, and we'll admit that it might be a mistake to cut it, but with this land and Follow the Imposter coming in, we decided to cut at least one other counter-producing card to try out the new stuff. Pledge of Unity is actually very likely to make an appearance again down the line, but we're going to give this land its time in the spotlight for now. It seems very good for the counters deck, spreading out 2 counters across 2 bodies, while also granting lifelink and vigilance for a turn, and doing so at a very cost-effective rate. Selesnya doesn't have a lot of draw power or card advantage, so getting some extra value from a land is perfect for the color pair, and the effect is perfect for this section. Rounding out our gold section is Golgari, which will have 2 changes. The uncommon saga, Binding the Old Gods, will replace Death Sprout. These are both comparable removal spells with ramp effects attached to them, and they each have their own nuances to make them distinct from each other. Death Sprout is an instant, it fetches any basic land, and it does so immediately. By comparison, Binding the Old Gods is sorcery speed removal, only fetches a forest, which makes it ineffective at mana fixing, and doesn't effectively ramp you until 2 turns after it's resolved. However, in its favor, it can destroy any non-land permanent, not just creatures. It's easier to cast and splash in non-Golgari decks, and it comes with a 3rd chapter, which doesn't add much, but is a bonus that shouldn't be forgotten. All in all, it's more versatile and serves much the same purpose, and has the added benefit of being removal in the form of an enchantment, which is easier to recur with cards like Fungal Rebirth or Acolyte of Affliction. It's not as clean and straightforward as Death Sprout, but we're convinced the average case for the saga is better. Golgari will also see a swap with Back for More taking the place of Moldervine Reclamation. Chris and I have both seen Reclamation do good things, but inconsistently, and the data shows that it's a pretty poor track record, so we decided to lean a little more heavily on Golgari's graveyard identity with Back for More. It was a bit of a letdown the last time we played it, but that was before some restructuring to Golgari's playstyle in the cube, so we're going to give it a second shot and see how it does. Kaldheim wasn't exactly generous with its colorless artifact section, but we've got one pickup to round out this update. Raider's Knave is coming in over Bomat Bazaar Barge, a vehicle that our players have made very clear that no one is interested in playing. We're not sure Raider's Knave is significantly better, but its ability to occasionally ramp you while beaten down is certainly better than the Bazaar Barge's ability to wheel in the draft and sit in your sideboard. Probably not a mainstay by any stretch, but we work with what we've got. And that's a wrap. Some of our sections got spoiled a bit more than others, with blue and white picking up the majority of our changes, and the gold section getting a bit of a rework with all the powerful gold cards in this set. We're eager to try out some of these changes, and I hope you'll join us for our first draft of this update coming up on Sunday the 31st. If you're looking for our Discord community, you can find links in the description below this video, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel below. Also, I've been tinkering around with the video editing and voice recording a little bit more. I'm no expert on this stuff, so feedback is always welcome. This has been Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time.